It's a pleasure to introduce Dean Moyar, professor of philosophy at the Johns Hopkins University, and is known to all of you, I'm sure. His very first publication was called Let's Talk About Love. So it started off well. And since then, he's written on mostly things in the history of 19th century philosophy, Kantian things, but topics like autonomy, ethics, life and death, and freedom, and then books on Hegel's conscience, and most recently on justice in Hegel's picture. Today, he'll be talking to us about Radical and Recognized Evil, Hegel's incorporation of the Counternormative.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me back there? Is it sound level okay? And thanks, to the organizers, to Thomas, to Wolfram, to Gustav, and to all of our hosts, to Isabel and everyone else who's been involved. Unlike Brady and Katerina, I really have no defense since I've been working on this, around this topic on conscience and practical reason for 20 years or so. But the invitation to this conference made me notice that I've really tended to downplay evil in my various accounts of around these texts. So this was actually a great opportunity to revisit all of these texts. I'm not sure that I have completely definite conclusions of any sort today, but hopefully we'll get to some interesting questions as we get towards the end. You've got a handout with a whole lot of quotes on it. I don't know how many of those I'll make it through. I think I'll check the time when we're about halfway through and might skip a number of the ones on the last couple pages. But I do want to read these two at the beginning from some folks writing about Hegel pretty recently. One from Jay Bernstein's 1996 article. Hence, if any significant action we perform either potentially or actually transgresses the possibilities of prospective justification, and hence transgresses what can, at that very moment, be recognized as of worth, thus transgressing what till that moment others conceive of as providing their worth and dignity, therein transgressing against them, then we are as conscientious subjects always evil, always false, always lost. For Hegel, quote, and this is now a quote from Zizek, the status of the subject as such is evil. So that's on an article that's mainly about conscience in the phenomenology. Robert Pippin's 2008 book, which leans more on the philosophy of right account, there he says, Hegel's notion of the will is simply practical reason, and so his position is more Socratic. There is no weakness of the will, there is only ignorance, self-deceit, and self-discovery. I almost added a paper that's about to be published in the Festschrift for Terry Pinkert by Robert Stern, where he argues that for Hegel, the will cannot choose evil. So there is quite a bit of difference, disagreement, unclarity about exactly how free evil is on Hegel's account and just how evil we are. And as I said, partly it represents a question of which text you take to be more central, as it plays a much bigger role in the phenomenology. At times, his view looks more like the Kant of the groundwork and second critique, the will is practical reason. And at times, as Wolfram said yesterday, he looks more like the religion account of evil. I mean, what's surprising about the what I'll call the Bernstein, Zizek, Gobsch view is that Hegel seems to take over at points a Fichtean view of conscience that seems more optimistic about self-knowledge in action, and he seeks to alleviate Kantian radical evil or original sin through shifting the focus to inner subjectivity. So it can seem like he really shouldn't have such a place for evil, given all the other things he does in his account. But it's true that he does affirm that we are evil by nature. And though I will give evil a more pivotal role in the sense that it provides a pivot in Hegel's account, I'm still not quite comfortable thinking that his view is as close to Kant's as some of his statements might make you think. All right, so paper's in 4 parts. First part, good and evil and the concept. I'd like to begin with a brief examination of evil in Hegel's view, apart from the specific conditions of ethical action. I mean, the latter will be the focus of the other three sections, but it's hard to get an accurate view of Hegel's claims without understanding how unusual his new conception of the concept is. So these are claims from what Hegel calls absolute spirit, the last three sort of sets of practices. And I'm going to skip art because obviously there's a place for evil in art, and I'm not going to dwell on that. And since Brady already talked about world history, I will not dwell on that either, but rather pick out a couple claims about the relation of evil to philosophy and the status of evil in Hegel's view of religion. Okay, so to the ordinary theorist of evil, it can appear that evil is simply a falling away from the good, a privation of the good, where the good is the positive or the universal. But Hegel founds his entire philosophical method and the notion of speculative philosophy on the denial that one can begin with the purely positive in transcendental logic or in ethics. And Brady's book on absolute negativity spells all of that out. And this is what Hegel tells us about in the edition from the lecture notes to section 139 of the Philosophy of Right, the main text on evil in that book. This is passage 3. The difficulty about the question of how the will can also be evil usually arises because we think of the will as having only a positive relationship to itself and envisage it as something determinate which exists for itself, i.e. as the good. The question of the origin of evil signifies more precisely this: how does the negative come into the positive? If we presuppose that at the creation of the world, God is absolutely positive, it is impossible to recognize the negative within this positive, no matter which way we turn. For to assume that evil was permitted by God is to assume on his part a passive relationship, which is unsatisfactory and meaningless. The solution of this problem from the point of view of the concept is contained in the concept itself. For the concept, or in more concrete terms, the idea, as the essential characteristic of differentiating itself and positing itself negatively. But from the point of view of the concept, positivity is apprehended as activity and self-differentiation. Thus, evil as well as good has its origin in the will, and the will in its concept is both good and evil. So Hegel comes pretty close here to saying that evil itself is endemic to the concept of the world, to God. And so far from being unintelligible, it is built into the structure of negativity that for him is the heart of all intelligibility. And he takes to be a virtue of his account that he has no problem finding a way to explain evil, or no need to worry about the question of how evil enters into the good. There is no pure good in the first place that would then have to be disrupted from another source. Now, this point is perhaps clearer through the parallel that Hegel draws in the Phenomenology preface between the false and evil. He, in this passage 4, is describing the role of determinate negation in the method and the sense in which the truth is a result that contains the false. He says, the true and the false belong to those determinate thoughts that are regarded as motionless essences unto themselves, with one standing fixedly here and the other standing fixedly there, and each being isolated from the other and sharing no commonality. Against that view, it must be maintained that truth is not a stamped coin issued directly from the mint and ready for one's pocket, nor is there a false no more than there is an evil. To be sure, evil and falsehood are not as bad as the devil, since if they are taken as the devil, they are made into particular subjects. However, as false and evil, they are only universals, even though they have an essentiality of their own vis-a-vis each other. So the problem in general there is that we presume to know that there's something simply positive, like the true or the good, and likewise something that is simply fixed apart as its opposite. But the true itself is a result of a series of determinate negations, a whole of moments developed through the negation of immediacy. In the text, he brings out a number of characters who don't understand this point in the text of the Phenomenology, such as the law of the heart, or virtue, who confronts the evil, self-interested person of the way of the world. And this is what I call incorporating the counternormative, which I'll talk about some more later, as when he takes these episodes and turns them into something positive. Hegel inevitably shows that the abstractly good and its enemy are the same, for the good only gets its determinacy through uniting with what it took to be evil. So again, in the phenomenology, the most important treatment of evil comes at the end of the spirit chapter, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it has its correlate at the level of religion in the discussion of the incarnation at the end of the religion chapter. And I can't interpret all the following two passages, but I just thought I would put them on here because they're so interesting and give you a sense of how unusual Hegel's account of good and evil is. So in 5, he's talking about the nature of religion as a representational practice and how it tries to deal with these concepts. And he says the other aspect, that of evil, is taken by representational thinking to be an event alien to the divine essence. To grasp evil in the divine essence itself, as the divine essence is wrath, is the supreme and most severe effort of which representational thinking, wrestling with itself, is capable. An effort which, since it lacks the concept, remains a fruitless struggle. Now, he then goes on to say, in that expression in passage 6, the expression that he's talking about there is the divine essence taking on human nature. And so he's trying to understand what it means for God to become man as Jesus, where man then is capable of evil, Jesus presumably. He says, in that expression, it is already stated that in itself both are not separated. Just as the divine essence therein relinquishes itself of itself at the very outset, just as its existence takes an inward turn and becomes evil, just as it is not explicitly stated but is contained in the expression, that in itself this evil existence is not alien to the divine essence. Absolute essence would be only an empty name. That's God, basically, would be only an empty name if in truth there were an other to it, if there were to be a fall from it. The moment of inwardly turned being instead constitutes the essential moment of the self of spirit. He goes on to say, when evil is the same as good, then evil itself is not evil, nor is goodness good, but both instead have been sublated. Evil per se is the inwardly turned being for itself, and the good is the selflessly simple. While in this way they are both expressed according to their concept, at the same time, the unity of the two becomes clear, for inwardly turned being for itself is simply knowing, and the selfless simple is likewise pure inwardly turned being for itself. And this is very close to making the same point that the passage that Wolfram had at the top of his talk from Hegel's logic was making there. And he's really sort of setting up these as universals, what he calls determinations of reflection that move into each other and eventually are overcome in the concept. So Hegel is justly known, I think, as a philosopher of transgression because of the centrality of negativity, but he's also known as a philosopher of reconciliation and someone who does not dwell on evil in the world. And the important place of forgiveness in the spirit account is testimony to this. And I just want to mention one more passage from Absolute Spirit, and that's from Philosophy of Religion, discussion of repentance. This is passage 7. He says, repentance or penitence signifies that through the elevation of human beings to the truth, which they now will, their transgression is wiped out. Because they acknowledge the truth over against their evil and will the good through repentance, their evil comes to naught. Thus, evil is known as something that has been overcome in and for itself, having no power of its own. The undoing of what has been done cannot take place in a sensible manner, but in a spiritual manner or inwardly. What has been done can be undone. So here he defends the practices of the Lutheran community in general as oriented by the belief that God as the good rules the world. So there is negativity and evil from the beginning, as it were, in Hegel's account, but that in a way only makes it easier for him to find a way to subordinate evil to the good in the end. And there's a famous line in the phenomenology, the wounds of spirit heal without scars, that reflects this same point, and I think makes some of us a little bit uneasy. Okay, now switching to ethical action constitutivism, section 2. I've divided this into 2 sections because I thought it would be interesting to say a little bit about the 2 different methods of deriving the conditions of action in the philosophy of right on the one hand, and the phenomenology on the other. I start with the philosophy of right because its account of action is more straightforward. And I'm tempted to back all the way up to the introduction, but I won't. For the topic of constitutivism, the morality chapter is the key text. There, Hegel gives a basic definition of action and then develops various stages of morality as flowing from that basic account. The account culminates with evil and hypocrisy and irony, necessitating a transition to the institutional account of Sittlichkeit, ethical life. In this section, I lay out the requirements and some of the complications in Hegel's attempt to get from action to Kantian universality and then to conscience. And in the next section, 3, I will look at his account of evil. So fortunately, Brady already told us some stuff about constitutivism. I'm not going to really dwell on it as an ethical theory. It's going to remain sort of vague in my account, but I'm interested to hear whether I mischaracterize it according to any of you. A constitutivist ethical theory typically proposes a relatively simple and relatively uncontroversial conception of action, and then argues that in order to act at all or to be an agent, one must meet some more substantive set of requirements that follow from that minimal view. That is, the first basic conditions for the success of action produce further reasons or requirements as we draw out what the original requirements imply. Now, one could argue that Hegel's view at the outset of morality is already too developed. We've already got abstract right and a bunch of other stuff on the scene before that, too developed to serve as such a basis, but let's try it out. It should be noted that Hegel explicitly says that this conception that he starts with is the basis of both moral and immoral action. So he's trying to give a relatively neutral account without building too much moral content into the basic version of agency. And the best kind of summary paragraph comes towards the end of the introduction, where he says, this is passage 8, the expression of the will as subjective or moral is action. Action contains the following determinations. Alpha, it must be known by me in its externality as mine. Beta, its essential relation to the concept is one of obligation. Gamma, it has an essential relation to the will of others. Now, setting aside beta for a moment, alpha and gamma do seem like reasonable basic features of action. When I act on a purpose, I must be able to impute it to myself not only as my intention prior to acting, but also in its externality or as an achieved purpose. The requirement gamma follows from Hegel's general thesis of the sociality of self-consciousness, or that what it is for an action to exist in externality is that it exists for other agents. The nature of the essential there is indeterminate at this point in the account, and Hegel develops that later in the morality chapter. Now, gamma here is seemingly innocuous. Its essential relation to the concept is one of obligation. But taking the concept to be the full account of what the will is supposed to be, it makes sense to think that at the level of minimal characterization, the full ideal would be viewed as a requirement or an obligation or an imperative. We could take this claim and related ones to indicate that the requirements developed as constitutive of action will be weak requirements vis-a-vis the determinate ethical good. They tell us what we ought to do in some sense, but they fall short of determining the will to specific ethical action. And I think that much is compatible with the standard constitutivist story. But this point is tied to a claim he makes in the remark to 112 that goes beyond standard accounts. He writes that the requirements are united only as a contradiction. So is he saying that actions have constitutive requirements that are in fact contradictory, and that action itself is therefore contradictory? Start to answering this question involves saying a few words about beta. His clear statement of the level of what he calls relation or obligation that morality occupies comes in the remark to 106. This is passage 9. He says the process within this sphere, and by process he means what the development of the content in the sphere looks like. The process within this sphere is such that the will, which at first has being only for itself and which is immediately identical only in itself, with the will which has being in itself, i.e. with the universal will, is superseded. And leaving behind it this difference which it has immersed itself in itself, it is posited for itself as identical with the will which has being in itself. All right, so with all those reflexives, it's a little bit bewildering, but if you just focus on the parenthetical remark, i.e. with the universal will, you get the basic idea. The import of beta is that the moral will exists as a tension between the particularity of the subject, its internal perspective on its own action, and the universality of the concept of the will that's carried over from the discussion of abstract right. The interplay of the particular and universal moments is what finally comes to a head in the discussion of evil and hypocrisy. So, I mean, one question for a Kant-Hegel comparison on this point is whether Hegel's requirement of particularity is different from Kant's claim that we necessarily pursue our own happiness. Is Kantian action also a contradiction, or does Kant's insistence on morality as the supreme condition mean that particularity is only a problem and not really a requirement? So it's kind of an open question, and I'd be interested to hear what others think about that. The first steps in Hegel's account are familiar. I'm just going to go very briefly through the rudiments of the morality account of action here. The first steps in Hegel's account are familiar and not especially controversial. He argues for a right of knowledge, i.e. that I must know the relevant circumstances in order for me to be held responsible for the action. Actually, he starts with the deed as a merely external intervention in the external world and differentiates that from an action, which is more closely identified with intentional action, which is a more restricted conception tied to the knowledge of the agent of what they are doing. Intention brings with it the universality of thought, the idea that action is a type, and that we should know as thinking beings what type of action we are doing as we are doing it. Now, the action as mine exists in a more particular sense as well. So from this universal requirement of intention, he switches back to a particular element of intention. And this is the whole account kind of goes with this switching back and forth. And this leads Hegel to posit a right of satisfaction, of subjective value, a right of subjective freedom. And it's in the long remark to this section 124 that he mentions this potential, let's say, criticism of Kant, do with repugnance what duty commands, right? And so he doesn't come out and accuse Kant of that, but he says, you can, if you want to set up an opposition between the subjective and the objective, or the particular and the universal, and then you might end up with a weird view like that. Hegel argues that the subjective and the objective shouldn't be opposed in this way. You can have both in one and the same action. And from yesterday's talks, I gather this might already be a version of what Kant calls impurity. Because Hegel says, yeah, go for it. Have both subjective and objective motives. Great. And don't think, as in the passage that Grady was talking about earlier, don't be like the valet and point out only the subjective things like the desire for fame and not the objective things, social good that's accomplished thereby. So sorting out your motives is not Hegel's concern, or at least it's a secondary concern. The main thing for him is to will objectively valuable actions. So he develops his account through an account of welfare and then introduces the welfare of others. He gives a right of necessity that brings abstract right and their initial moral requirements into conflict and then generates what he calls the good. Sort of looks like Kant's highest good out of that conflict. That leads him then in a few paragraphs to identify the will with Kant's conception of universality, and so say, in fact, that the universal is constitutive of the will. but then criticized the Kantian account famously for being an empty formalism because all it tells us is to do what's right and to help others, and that's not really very much. And then, so from that Kantian universal perspective, he then switches back to the particular moment and identifies that with conscience. Now, before getting to conscience, this passage 10 I put on the handout, I should say, Hegel generally says the requirements at this level of morality are formal. And there is a kind of question for constitutivist ethical theories whether that's a feature or a bug of those accounts, right? I mean, maybe that's a legitimate limitation of metaethics, and constitutivists should just accept these results. And Hegel's not happy to stay there. He thinks his account needs to give determinate duties, and that's what's going to move him into the rest of the account. But I do think it's sort of open to a metaethicist to say, hey, it's already quite a bit to even get these requirements on the table. So in passage 10, Hegel then comments on conscience, which he's called the particularity, moment of judgment. But here he says, actually, conscience is also answerable to the objective, to truth and falsity. He says, conscience is therefore subject to judgment as to its truth or falsity, and its appeal solely to itself is directly opposed to what it seeks to be. That is the rule for a rational and universal mode of action, which is valid in and for itself. So we can see that here how the particularity of conscience in the autonomy of its judgment is bound by norms of truth and falsity that are not contained in its own formal resources. Now, Hegel does not then turn around and list our duties or give us any truth-conducive procedure. Part of his point is going to be that the law itself, without specificity, is part of the problem rather than the solution. And this is what he draws out in his transition to ethical life. All right, now I introduced section B here, and I'll go through this pretty quickly for the sake of time, but I thought it might be interesting, people trying to sort out the phenomenology. I have a long account of this in my Hegel's Conscience book, and I hadn't really thought of it in terms of constitutivism, but it strikes me, given especially the passage with which I started from the phenomenology introduction, that it kind of makes sense to call this an inverse constitutivism in the phenomenology spirit chapter. And what do I mean by that? Right, conscience comes at the end of the spirit chapter. Ethical life, in the form of Greek ethical life, comes at the beginning. So it's like in that book, what happens is not so much minimal account whose success conditions lead us to a more substantive account, but rather an immediate substantive account that then fails over and over again, and by failing generates knowledge of the specific requirements of action. So each time you try out a shape of consciousness within the spirit chapter, they fail when put into practice. And from all this negativity or failure, action takes shape as a number of discrete moments that then are the conditions of action. So here's one of Hegel's summaries at the beginning of the Spirit Certain of Itself morality section, where he introduces Kantian morality. This is passage 11, where he's looking back on what's happened. The ethical world, as the Greeks. He says, the ethical world showed that its fate and its truth were only the departed spirit in that world, the singular self. However, this person of the law has its substance and fulfillment outside of that ethical world. The movement of the world of Bildung and of faith sublates this abstraction of the person, and through the perfected alienation and the highest abstraction, the French Revolution, the substance initially to the self of spirit comes to be the universal will, and then finally comes into spirit's own possession. So this is his abbreviated story of how Kantian autonomy came to be the core conception of modern normativity. His subsequent story from 596 touches again on the emptiness of pure duty, but focuses more on the problems in the highest good and the postulates. That is, he doesn't see how happiness or our determinate interest are supposed to find a stable role to play in the Kantian picture. So in a way, what he does is sort of play out the dialectic of practical reason in a pretty uncharitable way, but still kind of reflects, I mean, in a way, it reflects some of the things Anastasia was talking about, with the idea of God and how that's supposed to play into Kant's story about moral motivation. And so he thinks there's this dissemblance of moving the moments of action around that Kant uses to try to get duty and happiness into one picture, but that it really doesn't work. And so you need a successor concept, which is what he gives in the form of conscience. And yeah, I think I won't really say anything about it. I have this long quote, 641, which I have like 5 or 6 pages on in the book. And it's what I think gets really neglected in a lot of readings of the phenomenology. It's him bringing together all the moments of action under this concept of conscience. And if you understand that as Hegel's own account of what agency is as a result of what I've called this inverse constitutive project, it's sort of starting with the immediate and substantial and ending up with the formal and known and articulate conception of action with all these conditions, then you have modern moral agency and modern conscience. Of course, that's not the end of the story, which is why Spirit ends with evil and forgiveness. All right, so turning now to section 3, finally getting to evil proper, a free capacity for evil. So the text of 139 in the Philosophy of Right seems to state pretty clearly the view that agents are capable of acting freely to be evil. He writes, where all previously valid determinations have vanished and the will is in a state of pure inwardness, self-consciousness is capable of making into its principle either the universal in and for itself or the arbitrariness of its own particularity, giving the latter precedence over the universal and realizing it through its actions, i.e. it is capable of being evil. Now, he does seem to have something like the Kantian incorporation thesis here, insofar as he stresses making it into its principle. And he seems to count evil as an action. He says it through its actions, realizing one's particularity through one's actions at the expense of the universal. Hegel does preserve, a bit later in the text, makes clear that he preserves a certain guise of the good thesis insofar as he sees the evil. In most cases, he sees evil as opting for the pursuit of one's own good. And he too denies that you do evil for the sake of evil. So he too denies a diabolical will. But there's this question then of, does this claim explode the constitutivist thesis in admitting that one can be an agent in being evil? Or could this choice of evil serve some other form of constitutivism, a form that would have to work with a different conception of agency? Open questions I'm not going to really answer in a satisfying way. Though he says we are evil by nature, he also says that evil action is possible because one has the consciousness of the good and is in a position to know better. This isn't exactly the thesis of alternative possibilities that the traditional free will debates involve, but it does assert a certain space of options. And this, then he writes of the inwardness with regard to nature. This is him in the remark to 139 trying to spell this out, how this happens. Passage 14. He says, but when the will makes these desires, and I found it was a curious feature of the Nisbet translation, which is generally very good. The German word is machen. Nisbet gives it as let, right? So this debate, this question between whether you're letting something happen or whether you're doing something, as you all know, is like pretty important for these debates. And so it's kind of weird that he would have let that happen. But when the will makes these desires, etc., the determination of its content and the determination of contingency, which they have as natural, and hence also by the form which it has at this point, the form of particularity, it thereby becomes opposed to universality as inner objectivity, i.e. to the good, which along with the will's internal self-reflection and cognitive consciousness makes its appearance as the opposite extreme to immediate objectivity, to the merely natural. In this case, the inwardness of the will is evil. So he really does not seem to have a problem at all as thinking of this as a free choice for which one is responsible. So if you look at passage 15, he identifies this with subjectivity, picking it up at the end of that first line. The infinity of this reflection, which is faced with and present within this opposition, if it stops short at this juncture, i.e., if it is evil, it is consequently present for itself, retains its separate individuality, and is itself this arbitrary will. That's just Villecourt. It is accordingly the individual subject as such which bears the entire responsibility for its own evil. So no debate about that. All right. So this sounds to me like genuine, the full-blown choice here, not something that involves any sort of omission or some other way that certain constitutivists try to get out of admitting that evil is genuine action. It seems that it's a constitutive aspect of agency. And it can seem bizarre, since it seems like the whole point of constitutivism is to derive moral requirements from the concept of agency. The main vehicle for this derivation is the conditions for the success of minimal action. And if evil counts as success, and I guess that's just a question whether that's the right thing to say here, then the story has obviously gone wrong somewhere. So the answer lies in the contradictory requirements of action that I explored in the previous section. Because the requirements are contradictory, now this was alpha and gamma were not exactly contradictory, but when you look at them in these particular and universal ways, they kind of get driven into this contradictory stance. And that's what drives you on to the next stage in Hegel's account. So yeah, the discussion of evil and then 140, which comes after it, brings these demands into explicit opposition and calls for a transition. All right, so Section 3 continues with a few quotes from the Phenomenology. I think I'll only look at the last one of those. All right, so 16 and 17 are his descriptions of what happens at this unusual point where he's been talking about the beautiful soul and all of these other strange shapes that grow out of the original conception of conscience. And then he essentially gives the same account that we just saw in somewhat clearer terms in the philosophy of right, of what the evil action at that point actually looks like. And then in 18, we are brought to the account of what happens when he sets up this opposition where one character is this particular agent who's acted on the evil. The other character represents the sort of Kantian moral judge who only cares about universality and is pointing out in this action that it's evil, right? And you would think that that's just clearly a clear situation where the universal will be right, the evil agent would be wrong. And it turns out what Hegel then does is go on to say that these two are actually the same. Now, I should say there's a third thing that's slipped in here in one of these paragraphs where he says, of course, actual conscience isn't like that. And so there is a sense in which Hegel is affirming conscience as doing, based on your own authority, the right thing to do, but doing it on a purpose that's recognized by everybody else. So that's kind of there as a kind of like standard of what we're supposed to be doing, or kind of indication that in the end, once we get to the social level, we're going to have something like actual conscience in play. But before we get there, we have to see how these two different characters, one focused on their own particularity, one focused on the universal standard, actually are joined as the same character. One confesses, one forgives, and they end up making a transition to another level. So the quote in 16 is, sorry, we're in, quote is 18. He says, the judging consciousness, the universal one, is itself thereby base because it divides up the action in its judgment of the other person, and it both brings out and holds onto the action's inequality with itself. Furthermore, it is hypocrisy because he pretends that such judgment is not only another manner of being evil, but is rather itself the rightful consciousness of action. In his non-actuality and in the vanity he has in being such a fault finder, he places himself far above the deeds it excoriates, and he wants to know that his speech, which is utterly devoid of any deeds, is to be taken as superior actuality. All right, so that's the problem that Hegel then solves with the discussion of confession and forgiveness, which then leads to this line that the wounds of spirit heal with no scars, that lead one to think, well, maybe he really doesn't believe in evil in the end, right? Like it seems like maybe it's just a reflective concept at the level of morality, and once we've reached ethical life, we can kind of get rid of that concept, right? And I think that is unusual and should make us a little bit uneasy. Not that I'm exactly endorsing that, but I want to be a little bit more critical in this final section than I otherwise am towards Hegel's account of ethical life, because I think his incorporation of particularity in ethical life has some problematic aspects when viewed under the rubric of evil.
You're at 40 minutes.
40 minutes, okay. Yeah, I should be 7 minutes maybe, I would guess. So ethical life is a system of institutions in which individuals have clearly defined duties and right is grounded in legally sanctioned contexts of action. Yeah, one has the distinct impression that in this domain, the problem of evil does not even arise, since the will is not in the indeterminate space in which making my particularity paramount against the universal arises. It's also anything but clear whether one can occupy the moral and ethical standpoints alternately or simultaneously, or whether one has really left the moral behind when one has started a family of one's own, chosen a job, etc. It is clear enough from the transition that ethical life derives from moral agency in the sense that it stabilizes the various requirements that are set out individually in morality, right? He says they're united as a contradiction. That's looking forward already to ethical life where they're united, but not as a contradiction. The question is, how does he do that? How does he incorporate that tension which produced counternormativity into ethical life itself? One question you could ask here is, does the overcoming of evil also entail an overcoming of freedom? So in this question, I think it's just right to think of freedom and evil as going together, at least in our intuitive conceptions of it. And Hegel, of course, thinks that the freedom of the moral point of view is inferior to the social freedom of ethical life. Saying more about that would get us into his view of mutual recognition, which I'm not about to do. But he does think that it's satisfying a demand from morality itself to have fully determinate rational content, and that being with oneself in the other in that sense is what makes one free. Now, an interesting aspect of the move to ethics is that the requirements on the will are transformed in two rather different directions. On the one hand, they are no longer obligations because the will, including the drives as a kind of second nature, finds them adequate and is shaped by their purposes. So these requirements, once you're in these contexts, are less demanding than the kind of rigorism of Kantian morality. Yet these requirements are also very specific, and in fact so specific that they no longer seem plausible candidates or requirements on action as such at all. Like you have to get married in order to be an agent or something. Like it starts seeming kind of bizarre. I've given you a couple quotes. I think I won't read 19 for the sake of time. These all come from the preamble text to ethical life, where he's describing what it means to make this transition. In 20, he says, in this way, ethical substantiality has attained its right, and the latter has attained validity. That is, the self-will of the individual and his own conscience in its attempt to exist for itself and in opposition to the ethical substantiality have disappeared. That's obviously kind of alarming. If you put enough weight on the opposition to ethical substantiality, you can convince yourself this is okay. But obviously it depends on the ethical substantiality actually being good. In 21, he makes explicit that something that arose in morality is now satisfied. The right of individuals to their subjective determination to freedom is fulfilled insofar as they belong to ethical actuality and affirm it. All right, so in closing, there's only really 2 points I want to make about evil now. I mean, one point is that it does seem like he has now a deflationary account of what we could call objective evil. So this passage 22, which I found in the 1820 lectures, is kind of striking. But in the genuinely good, evil also always appears. A human being who has to act in a concrete and fulfilled life must also know to be capable of evil. In the pursuit of the essential purpose, a host of purposes that could otherwise be valid are neglected. Thus, if the evil is on the one hand a moment of the will, it furthermore also always appears in actuality. Now, I used to like this passage as a kind of acknowledgement of moral conflicts and in its stress on the concrete and fulfilled life. I'll say in a second why I'm now more worried about this. It relates to my second point. In this main way of incorporating the counternormative into ethical life is to give a very important role to what we would call agent relative duties or agent relative values. That's in a way what all the institutions are for, is to allow individuals in modern ethical life to pursue their own particularity because they're embedded within these universal structures, romantic marriage, and especially right in the middle of the text, civil society pursuing your own interest as a kind of economic self-interested agent, right? And, you know, as I said, I think agent relative duties and values are great. I would not want a theory that didn't have those there. But when you look at Hegel's texts, and remember that this is his only account of normativity, right? It's not like there's a separate ethics next to this. It's all packed into the philosophy of right because he thinks morality outside of these legally sanctioned institutions is not really real. It needs that context in order to be what it is. It can seem like what he's doing in civil society is simply saying it's okay to be evil, right? And if you start looking at it that way, it starts looking kind of disturbing. I mean, I put 23 and 24 here to give you an idea of what happens in the phenomenology when he starts looking at conscience and its attempt to hold together the various moments of its action. And if his language of moments bothers you, I think of these moments as like elements of a Kantian maxim. He's like, all right, your maxim is going to have like some particular interest or utility that it does for you, and it's going to have a universal character. You're going to bind this all together under your conscience, and you go out and you know, be an agent and live a concrete life. And what this ends up kind of looking like in civil society is that, yeah, okay, you're licensed to go pursue your self-interest. And he thought he had reasons that modern state and modern religion could rein this in, right? He says this is the same thing that the sophists started doing in ancient Greece and ruined the ancient Greek polis. But since we have a better religion and a stronger state, we can deal with this particularity and let it develop and flourish within the modern state. But yeah, he seems to really, I think, have been wrong about that. Been wrong, that is, that the state is a match for civil society and that modern religion would be enough to rein in the pursuit of particularity once you've kind of let it out of the bag. That's it. Thank you.